3 days until a judge decides whether Ethan Cole deserves to be a father. 3 days before his daughter gets ripped from his arms and handed back to the mother who abandoned her. Tonight, after 14 hours of exhausting work, Ethan will spot two 15-year-old twin girls stranded on the highway, panicked and helpless. He knows he shouldn't stop. Too tired, too late, too many risks. But he will anyway. Ethan has no idea that one small decision in this storm will bring him face to face with his own fate. Can kindness save a poor father? Ethan Cole sat in his beat-up Honda Civic, rain hammering the windshield like fists. The dashboard clock blinked 11:47. He'd been awake for 14 hours straight, and his phone buzzed with another text from Mr. Roberts, his court-appointed attorney. The message read, "Prepare yourself. They have a strong team. This isn't looking good." 3 more days, 72 hours until a stranger in a black robe decided whether he deserved to keep his daughter. Ethan pressed his palms against his eyes and thought about Alice, 6 years old with a smile that could light up their cramped apartment. She'd been only 4 when Vanessa walked out without explanation, leaving just an empty closet and a toddler asking why mommy didn't come home. That was 2 years ago. 2 years of working double shifts, manufacturing plant in the morning, security guard at night, just to keep the rent paid and food in the fridge. 2 years of learning to braid hair from YouTube videos and reading the same bedtime story every night because it was the only one that helped Alice fall asleep. Then Vanessa reappeared 6 months ago with a new husband, a suburban house, and a lawyer who filed custody papers arguing that Alice deserved stability and resources. All the things Ethan couldn't provide on $32,000 a year. The bank statements didn't lie. Late rent payments, utility bills pushed to final notice, a life one unexpected expense away from collapse. The rain intensified as Ethan pulled onto the highway. He needed to get home to Mrs. Garcia, the 73-year-old neighbor who watched Alice for $20 a week and whatever homemade dinners Ethan could manage on weekends. The highway stretched empty until he spotted the black Mercedes on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking weakly through the downpour. 2 teenage girls stood beside the car, soaked through and holding up cell phones like drowning people reaching for life preservers. Twins, by the look of them. 15 years old, maybe, wearing expensive clothes that offered zero protection against the storm. One was crying. The other had her arm around her sister, trying to be brave. Ethan's foot hovered over the brake. He was exhausted. Alice was waiting, and the smart thing would be to call it in and keep driving. But he thought about his daughter stranded and terrified on a dark highway, with no one coming to help. The decision made itself. He pulled onto the shoulder. The rain soaked through his jacket as he grabbed the emergency poncho from his trunk. Both girls turned toward him, expressions shifting from hope to uncertainty. He understood that look. A black man approaching in the dark triggered caution, even when you desperately needed help. The girl on the left spoke first, voice shaking. They'd been heading home from a music recital when the car died. Their driver had tried to fix it, but they'd smelled alcohol on his breath and told him to leave. Now they had no cell service and no way home. Ethan asked where their parents were. The other twin said their father was out of town for work, always out of town. Their mother had passed away 3 years ago. It was just them and their dad, except he was never actually there. Ethan held out the poncho to the crying girl and asked their names. Emma and Lily Morrison, 15 years old and stranded. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number Emma recited from memory. A man's voice answered, rough with stress. Ethan explained quickly. He'd found the man's daughters on Highway 41 near the Riverside exit. Their car had broken down. They were safe, but needed someone to come get them. The man's voice changed immediately, fear replacing irritation. After confirming the girls were unhurt, he said he was nearly 2 hours away at a conference, but would leave immediately. He offered to pay for a tow truck, for Ethan's time, whatever it took. Ethan looked at the shivering girls and said not to worry about payment. He'd wait with them and make sure they stayed safe. The man's voice broke slightly when he said, "Thank you." Ethan told the girls to get in his car where it was warm. They climbed into the back seat without hesitation. He turned up the heat and pulled out an old blanket. Emma wrapped it around both of them, and gradually their shivering eased. After a few minutes of silence, Lily asked if he had kids. Something in her voice made the question sound genuine rather than polite. Ethan told them about Alice. 6 years old, loved purple instead of pink, could recite her favorite storybook from memory. He told them about Sunday pancakes and bedtime stories and learning to braid hair. Then, because exhaustion had worn down his filters, he told them the rest. About the custody hearing in 3 days, about Vanessa returning with money and lawyers, about feeling like no matter how hard he worked or how much he loved his daughter, it might not be enough. Emma said quietly that their father was a judge. He presided over cases exactly like Ethan's, deciding which parent deserved to keep their children. He was brilliant and respected, but he didn't know what color they liked or what scared them at night. He worked constantly, building a career everyone admired while his daughters grew up in an empty house. Lily added that they'd rather have less money and more time with him. They'd trade the big house for a father who came to their recitals and remembered their birthdays without his assistant's reminders. Ethan thought about the strange parallel. Here were girls who had everything money could buy, but craved presents. And here he was, fighting to keep his daughter, despite having nothing material except that presence. Nearly 90 minutes passed before headlights appeared. A silver Lexus pulled up, and a tall man with graying hair stepped out into the rain. He pulled both girls into a fierce hug the moment they emerged from Ethan's car. The man turned to Ethan with red-rimmed eyes. He held out his hand and said his name was William Morrison, and he owed Ethan more than words could express. He reached for his wallet. Ethan shook his head. He'd done what any decent person would do, Morrison insisted, saying Ethan had gone far beyond expectation, waiting with strangers when he clearly had somewhere else to be. Ethan looked at Emma and Lily, standing close to their father, and said the only payment he needed was knowing they were safe. Morrison's expression shifted into something unreadable. Gratitude mixed with shame, maybe, or recognition of some uncomfortable truth. He said again that he was in Ethan's debt, and if there was ever anything he could do, Ethan should just ask. Then he ushered his daughters into the Lexus and drove away into the rain. Ethan sat for a moment, thinking about debts and gratitude, about the strange ways life connected people who would never otherwise meet. Then he headed home to Alice, who was waiting up past her bedtime. He had no way of knowing that the man whose hand he'd just shaken would decide his daughter's fate in 3 days. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness had just set everything in motion. The courthouse smelled like old wood and anxiety. Ethan wore his only suit, bought secondhand 5 years ago, now too tight across the shoulders and half an inch too short. Alice sat beside him, gripping his hand, wearing the purple dress Mrs. Garcia had bought her for Easter, her hair in 2 perfect braids that had taken Ethan 40 minutes to achieve. Mr. Roberts shuffled papers with the nervous energy of someone who knew he was outmatched. In his early 60s, with kind eyes and a rumpled suit, he'd taken the case because he believed in Ethan. But belief didn't win custody battles against $400 an hour attorneys. The courtroom doors opened, and Vanessa walked in like she owned the building. Cream-colored dress, perfect hair, new husband's hand on her back. Behind them came Mr. Mitchell, her attorney, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the expression of someone who'd never lost. Vanessa's eyes found Ethan, and something flickered. Guilt, maybe. Then disappeared. She didn't look at Alice, didn't acknowledge the daughter she'd abandoned. She just arranged her face into concerned motherhood and took her seat. The bailiff called everyone to rise. The judge's chamber door opened, and Ethan's world tilted sideways. William Morrison emerged in black robes, the same man who'd stood in the rain 3 nights ago hugging his daughters with desperate relief. Their eyes met. Recognition flashed across Morrison's face, but his expression remained professionally neutral. He took his seat and arranged his papers deliberately, not looking up as the bailiff announced the case. In the matter of Cole versus Cole, petition for modification of custody arrangements. Ethan's mind raced. Would Morrison recuse himself, lean backward to prove impartiality, and give Vanessa everything? Or could this connection somehow help? He forced himself to breathe slowly, trying to calm the rising panic. Morrison called the court to order. Both parties stated their names for the record. Vanessa's voice smooth and confident, Ethan's cracking slightly. Then Morrison asked for opening arguments. Mitchell stood first, buttoning his jacket with practiced ease. He acknowledged that custody cases were difficult, that no one questioned Ethan's love. But love wasn't enough when a child's welfare hung in the balance. He painted Ethan's life with cold precision. Working 2 jobs to stay afloat, barely present, struggling to provide necessities, much less opportunities. Mitchell spread financial records across the table like crime scene evidence. Late rent payments, final notice utility bills, no savings, no college fund. A 1-bedroom apartment where Alice slept on a pull-out couch because her father couldn't afford better. A 73-year-old neighbor watching her after school because Ethan worked until 9 most nights. Each word hit Ethan like a physical blow. Everything was true, but stripped of context and love it sounded damning. Yes, he worked long hours, but every minute went toward keeping Alice safe. Yes, Mrs. Garcia was elderly, but she loved Alice like her own granddaughter. Yes, they shared a bedroom, but Alice had never felt deprived, had always known she was cherished. Mitchell continued, describing Vanessa's transformation. Therapy completion, addiction counseling to address her past struggles, stable marriage to a successful businessman, 4-bedroom suburban house with a yard and good schools, college fund with $50,000 already deposited, everything a growing child needed. Then, Mitchell presented statements from 3 child development experts, agreeing that stability and resources mattered more than any single factor. A parent's love was important, but it couldn't substitute for material advantages that set children up for success. When Mitchell sat down, Mr. Roberts stood with less polish, but equal determination. He spoke from the heart about what he'd witnessed, a father who worked himself to exhaustion, but never missed bedtime stories, who learned to braid hair from internet videos, who showed up to every parent-teacher conference even when it meant losing wages. Roberts called Mrs. Garcia to the stand. She wore her Sunday dress and clutched her purse nervously. But when asked about Ethan, her voice strengthened. She'd lived next door for 3 years and had never seen a more devoted father. 14-hour workdays, yet he still helped with homework, listened to school stories, maintained the same bedtime routine every night. Mitchell's cross-examination was brief and cutting. How much did Ethan pay her? $20 a week. Barely minimum wage. What about her age and health issues? Wasn't she inadequate supervision? Mrs. Garcia flushed, but stated firmly she watched Alice because she loved the child, not for money. Next came Ms. Thompson, Alice's kindergarten teacher. She testified that Alice was one of the happiest, most well-adjusted children in her class. The girl talked constantly about her father, about pancakes and bedtime stories, about feeling loved and safe. In 23 years of teaching, Thompson could spot the difference between a child who had everything material and one who had everything that mattered. Alice fell firmly in the second category, but Mitchell was ready. Did Alice have her own bedroom? Thompson didn't know. Any extracurricular activities? No, though many children didn't. Mitchell sat down, having made his point. Love was wonderful, but it didn't pay for opportunities that shaped successful adults. Morrison called for lunch recess. In the hallway, Ethan shared peanut butter sandwiches with Alice, while Roberts said quietly that Mitchell's case was stronger than anticipated, that they needed to prepare for the possibility of losing. Ethan looked at Alice carefully peeling crusts off her sandwich, smiling up at him with complete trust. He asked Roberts their real chances. The old lawyer met his eyes and said honestly that, unless something dramatic changed, Vanessa would likely win primary custody. The afternoon session began with Vanessa taking the stand. She looked small and vulnerable, voice breaking as she described her mistakes 4 years ago. Postpartum depression spiraling into something darker. Feeling overwhelmed and making the terrible choice to run instead of asking for help. Years in therapy, learning to manage her mental health. She wanted a second chance to give Alice the childhood she deserved, the opportunities Ethan simply couldn't provide. When Roberts cross-examined her, he asked about Alice's favorite color. Vanessa hesitated before answering pink. Roberts noted that Alice's favorite was actually purple, as evidenced by her dress. Vanessa's composure cracked, but she recovered, saying she'd mixed up the colors in her nervousness. She correctly answered Alice's birthday and favorite food. Morrison had been taking notes throughout, his pen moving with quick, decisive strokes. When Ethan took the stand, he walked on legs that felt disconnected. He swore to tell the truth and described his typical day. Waking at 5 to prepare breakfast and pack lunches, dropping Alice at school before the plant shift, working straight through to the security job, coming home at 8:30, bone-tired but never too tired to ask about her day, help with homework, read the chosen bedtime story. He talked about Sunday pancakes, learning to braid hair, birthday parties with homemade cake, and presents scraped together over months, about loving his daughter with every breath, about her being the reason he pushed through the exhaustion. Mitchell's cross-examination was brutal. How many hours per week? 60 to 70. Who watched Alice? Mrs. Garcia. Her age and training? 73. No formal training, no backup care. Where did Alice sleep? Pull-out couch in the living room. Extracurricular activities? None. Couldn't afford them. Music lessons, sports, camps? No. Mitchell asked about late rent payments and final notice utilities. Ethan explained he'd been short a few times but always caught up. Mitchell asked if living one unexpected expense away from homelessness was really stable environment for a 6-year-old. Ethan wanted to scream that he'd never let Alice go homeless, that poverty didn't equal neglect. But the words caught because he saw the truth in the questions. He was one emergency away from disaster. When he stepped down, Roberts looked defeated. Vanessa looked sympathetic in a way that made Ethan's skin crawl. Morrison's expression remained unreadable as he called a 15-minute recess before closing arguments. In the hallway, Alice asked if they could go home soon, have pancakes for dinner even though it wasn't Sunday. Ethan promised they would, fighting to keep his voice steady. Roberts said quietly that he was sorry, that he'd done his best. Before they could re-enter the courtroom, a court officer approached. Judge Morrison wanted to see Ethan in chambers, alone. Roberts objected that all proceedings should be on record, but the officer said the judge had been very clear. Ethan followed down a narrow hallway to a door marked Chambers. Heart hammering. Morrison was going to recuse himself, or worse, rule against Ethan privately to soften the blow. He knocked and heard Morrison's voice tell him to enter. The judge stood behind his desk, still robed, face grave. He gestured for Ethan to sit, but Ethan remained standing, unable to settle when his future hung in the balance. Morrison said he needed Ethan to understand something before they returned. What he was about to do wasn't because of debt, wasn't because Ethan had helped his daughters 3 nights ago. He'd spent considerable time reviewing this case before ever walking into the courtroom. He'd done his own research, pulled records, asked questions beyond what either attorney presented. He'd learned things about both parties that changed the case entirely. He was not recusing himself, Morrison said, because he believed the truth needed to be heard, and he was best positioned to ensure it was. He told Ethan to prepare himself. The next hour would be difficult for everyone, but justice required more than bank statements and living arrangements. It required looking at the whole truth, even when ugly and uncomfortable. He asked if Ethan trusted him to do what was right for Alice. Ethan found himself nodding, though he had no idea what Morrison meant. They returned to the courtroom. Roberts whispered that private meetings with judges never happened in cases like this. Morrison took the bench and said he'd reviewed all evidence and found the case more complex than it appeared. Before closing arguments, he would call additional witnesses. Mitchell objected immediately. They hadn't been notified of additional witnesses. This was highly irregular. Morrison overruled with a tone suggesting the objection was both noted and irrelevant. A man in a dark suit entered carrying a folder. Morrison introduced him as a private investigator, hired independently to verify certain facts. Mitchell was on his feet, demanding to know on what authority the judge conducted his own investigation. Morrison said calmly the judges had broad discretion in custody matters, and he'd exercised it to ensure complete information before making a decision affecting a child's life. The investigator opened his folder. He'd been asked to look into Vanessa Cole's background, specifically her claims about recovery and stability. What he found painted a very different picture. Evidence of cocaine use as recently as 6 months ago. Prescriptions for controlled substances from multiple doctors. A rehabilitation facility stay she'd checked out of against medical advice after only 8 days. The courtroom erupted. Mitchell shouted objections. Vanessa had gone pale, hands gripping the table. Her husband looked stunned. Morrison gavelled for order and said Mitchell would review all evidence, but testimony would continue. The investigator presented documentation, pharmacy records, medical files obtained through proper channels, witness statements. The therapy completion certificate her attorney submitted was fraudulent, created by a clinic shut down for exactly that fraud 3 months ago. Every claim about recovery was built on lies, but the investigator wasn't finished. He'd also looked into Vanessa's motivation for seeking custody. Her new husband couldn't have children due to medical condition. Vanessa herself had sustained damage during Alice's birth, making future pregnancies impossible. Gaining custody would give them the family they wanted without adoption complications. There were also insurance and tax benefits, estate planning considerations that made Alice valuable in ways unrelated to motherhood. Ethan felt sick. He looked at Vanessa and saw her composure crumbling, saw truth written across her face. She wasn't here because of maternal instincts. She was here because Alice served a purpose in the life she'd built. Morrison asked if Mitchell wanted to cross-examine. He declined, face red with barely controlled anger. Morrison thanked the investigator and dismissed him, then turned to Vanessa. He asked directly if the testimony was accurate. Mitchell tried to invoke self-incrimination rights, but Morrison said this wasn't criminal proceeding, and he expected an answer. Vanessa's voice came barely above a whisper. Yes, it was true. She'd lied about treatment, recovery, her reasons for wanting Alice back. Morrison leaned back and surveyed the courtroom. He'd seen many custody cases, but few involving this level of deception. He understood addiction was a disease deserving second chances, but those chances had to be built on honesty and genuine change. Vanessa had built her case on lies, attempted to manipulate the court, and that spoke to character in ways no amount of money could overcome. He turned to Ethan, expression softening. The court had heard testimony about Ethan's financial struggles, long work hours, modest living situation, all true and concerning. But the court had also heard about a father who showed up every day, who made his daughter's well-being his priority, despite overwhelming obstacles, who built a life of love and stability without material resources. Morrison said he'd also learned something about Ethan, not in any official record. 3 nights ago, after working 14 hours, exhausted and facing his own crisis, Ethan stopped on a dark highway to help 2 stranded teenagers. He waited with them for hours, ensured their safety, refused payment or recognition. That action told Morrison more about Ethan's character than any financial statement could. The judge's voice grew firm as he delivered his ruling. He was granting full custody to Ethan Cole. Vanessa would be permitted only supervised visitation after completing legitimate rehabilitation and demonstrating sustained sobriety. She would undergo psychological evaluation before any visitation. The court would review the arrangement in 1 year, but until then, Alice remained with her father. Ethan couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air like something he was afraid to touch. Roberts gripped his shoulder. Vanessa sobbed openly as her husband led her toward the exit, Mitchell gathering papers with jerky movements. Morrison met Ethan's eyes across the courtroom and gave the smallest nod. Not favoritism or debt repayment, but simple acknowledgement that justice had been served. Then he stood and exited to chambers. Alice tugged on Ethan's sleeve and asked if they could go home now. Ethan picked her up, feeling her weight against his chest, and said yes. They could go home and stay there, together, for as long as she wanted. She wrapped her arms around his neck and said she was hungry for pancakes, and Ethan laughed, the sound breaking free like something that had been trapped too long. The courthouse steps felt different as Ethan carried Alice down that afternoon. The concrete was the same, the worn granite unchanged, but everything else had shifted in ways he was still trying to comprehend. Alice had fallen asleep against his shoulder, exhausted from the tension she'd absorbed without understanding. Her breath came warm and steady against his neck. Mr. Roberts walked beside him, still talking with the excitement of someone who'd witnessed something extraordinary. He'd never seen anything like it in 40 years. Judges simply didn't conduct independent investigations. Morrison had taken a massive professional risk, but justice had been served in a way legal maneuvering and financial resources could never achieve. Mrs. Garcia waited at the bottom of the steps, face wet with relief. She reached out to touch Alice's back and told Ethan she'd known it would work out. Ethan wanted to believe in cosmic justice, but he knew the truth was more complicated. He'd gotten lucky being in the right place at the right time. He was settling Alice into her booster seat when he heard footsteps. Morrison stood a respectful distance away, no longer wearing robes, just a tired man in a white shirt with his jacket over one arm. He asked for a moment. Morrison spoke first. He needed Ethan to understand that what happened in the courtroom wasn't about repaying debt. The investigation had been underway before Morrison knew Ethan would be in his courtroom, started the moment he'd read the case file and noticed inconsistencies. That Ethan was the same man who'd helped his daughters was coincidence, albeit one that made the case infinitely more complicated. Morrison said he'd almost recused himself that morning. Professional ethics demanded it. But he'd read the investigator's preliminary report the night before, seen enough to know Vanessa's case was built on fraud, and couldn't hand the matter to another judge who might not dig as deep. So he'd made a choice that could end his career if anyone challenged it. Ethan asked why Morrison would take that risk for someone he barely knew. The judge was quiet before answering. It was because of what Emma and Lily told him after that night. They'd talked about Ethan for hours, about how exhausted he'd looked but stopped anyway, how he'd spoken of his daughter with fierce love despite knowing he might lose her. They'd asked their father if judges ever made decisions based on what kind of person someone was, rather than what they owned. Morrison said the question haunted him. He'd built his career on impartiality, following the law without personal feelings interfering. But his daughters reminded him that law was supposed to serve justice, and justice meant looking at the whole person, not just their bank account. When he'd seen Ethan's name on the docket, he knew he had to ensure this case was decided on truth rather than financial advantage. He told Ethan he'd be facing ethics review, that Mitchell had already filed complaint, that his career might not survive scrutiny. But he'd watched his daughters grow up with material advantages and emotional emptiness, seen how that imbalance damaged them in ways money couldn't fix. He couldn't let another child be placed in that situation just because the system favored wealth. Ethan asked what would happen if the review went badly. Morrison shrugged. He'd practiced law before becoming judge, and could practice again if necessary. What mattered was that Alice would grow up with the parent who actually wanted to be her parent. They stood in silence, two men who'd been strangers a week ago now, bound by circumstances neither could have predicted. Morrison said he should let Ethan get Alice home, but he pulled an envelope from his pocket. It was a recommendation letter for a county maintenance job with better hours and benefits that might ease financial pressure. Ethan took the envelope but asked if Morrison was helping out of guilt. The judge met his eyes directly. No, he was helping because Ethan had proven himself exactly the kind of person the community needed, and because Emma and Lily had asked him to. They wanted to know the man who'd helped them would be okay. His daughters had learned more from Ethan's example than from any lecture about character and sacrifice. Morrison turned to leave, then looked back. One more thing. The custody arrangement included review in 1 year, standard in cases involving substance abuse allegations. If Vanessa completed legitimate treatment and demonstrated sustained sobriety, she might petition for expanded visitation. Ethan needed to be prepared. Ethan said he understood, though the thought made his chest tight. Morrison told him not to borrow trouble from the future. A year was long, and recovery was hard. For now, Alice was safe, and home was secure. He offered his hand. Ethan shook it, feeling the firm grip of someone who'd put everything on the line for principle. Morrison walked to his Lexus, and Ethan watched until it pulled away. Then he got into his Honda and sat listening to Alice's soft breathing. The enormity of what had happened was settling over him. He'd walked into that courthouse expecting to lose everything, and had walked out with more than he'd dared hope for. The drive home took them through familiar streets that looked different, transformed by his new reality. Mrs. Garcia met them at the door with ingredients for celebration dinner. She shooed Ethan toward the couch to rest while she cooked. Alice woke when cooking smells filled the apartment. She rubbed her eyes and asked if the courthouse day was really over, if she could stay with Daddy forever. Ethan told her yes, as long as she wanted, and she smiled with pure relief. She asked about pancakes anyway, even though Mrs. Garcia was cooking, and Ethan laughed and promised pancakes for breakfast. They ate crowded around the kitchen table, Mrs. Garcia telling childhood stories, while Alice listened with wide eyes. The food was simple, but good, and Ethan found himself thinking this was what mattered, not apartment size or bank balance, but these moments of warmth and connection. Alice had that now, guaranteed and protected by law. Later, after Mrs. Garcia had gone and Alice was tucked into bed, Ethan sat in darkness and let himself feel the full weight of what had happened. He thought about the storm 3 nights ago, about stopping for 2 stranded girls when every logical reason said to keep driving. How that choice had set in motion events that saved his daughter and maybe changed Morrison's understanding of what mattered in his own life. The ethics review worried him. The idea that helping him might cost Morrison his career felt wrong, but Morrison had made his choice with full knowledge of consequences, decided some principles were worth professional risk. Ethan could only live in a way that honored that sacrifice. 6 months passed before Ethan saw William Morrison again. The job recommendation had led to a county position with better hours and health insurance, making the difference between struggling and stable. Ethan had cut back to 1 job, could be home when Alice got out of school, had weekends free for park trips and library visits. The apartment was still small and budget tight, but the constant panic had eased into something manageable. The meeting happened at a community center spring fair. Ethan was helping Alice with a craft project when he heard familiar voices and looked up to see Morrison with Emma and Lily. The girls spotted him first and came running over, hugging him like a favorite uncle. They introduced themselves to Alice and asked to help with her project. Soon, all three girls were laughing over glue sticks and construction paper. Morrison approached slowly. He looked different, lighter, less burdened. He told Ethan the ethics review had concluded 2 months ago with formal reprimand, but no removal from the bench. The review board acknowledged his methods were unorthodox, but ultimately agreed that ensuring child welfare took precedence over procedural perfection. Emma and Lily had been asking about Alice since the trial, wanting to know if she was okay, if Ethan had kept his daughter. Morrison had followed the case peripherally through public records, seen that Vanessa hadn't entered treatment or filed for modified visitation. She'd apparently moved on without looking back. Morrison asked how Ethan was managing. Ethan told him about smaller struggles and larger victories, about Alice thriving in school and making friends, about Sunday pancakes becoming a tradition Alice now helped make. Life wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, built on love and presence that no money could create. The judge said he'd learned something from this experience, something his daughters had been trying to teach him for years. Being present mattered more than being successful. Time was the one resource you couldn't earn back. He'd cut back his schedule, started declining conferences and speaking engagements. They'd had dinner together every night this week, and his daughters actually talked instead of giving one-word answers. Emma ran over to show them a picture she and Alice had made. 4 stick figures holding hands under a bright sun, labeled Emma, Lily, Alice, and Daddy. Morrison looked at the drawing and then at Ethan, and something passed between them that didn't need words. Alice tugged Ethan's sleeve and asked if Emma and Lily could come over for pancakes sometime. Morrison smiled and said his daughters would love that. Ethan found himself agreeing, making plans for the following Sunday. The spring fair continued around them, children laughing, parents chatting, popcorn smell drifting through warm afternoon air. Ethan stood with Alice's hand in his, watching her show Emma and Lily how to fold origami birds. Morrison stood beside him, and neither felt the need to fill the comfortable silence. Later, driving home with Alice chattering about her new friends, Ethan thought about fate and coincidence, and the strange ways life sometimes rewarded kindness when you least expected it. He'd stopped on a dark highway because it was the right thing to do, not because he expected anything in return. That decision had saved his daughter, taught a judge about priorities, and connected 2 families who might help each other become better versions of themselves. Alice asked if they could make extra pancakes Sunday, enough for everyone. Ethan promised they would, already planning to wake early and make the morning special for the girls who'd become part of their unexpected extended family. The apartment looked welcoming when they pulled into the parking lot, lights from other units creating warm glow against evening sky. It wasn't much, this small space they called home, but it was enough. More than enough, because it held everything that mattered. Love and safety, and the promise of Sunday pancakes, of friends who saw past material circumstances, of second chances and new beginnings built on kindness. Ethan carried Alice upstairs, though she was really too big to be carried, and she laughed and said she could walk. He set her down, but kept hold of her hand, and together they climbed the last flight of steps. Behind them, the world continued its complicated dance of chance and choice and consequence. But here, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. A father and daughter going home together, their future secure, their family maybe a little bigger than it had been that morning. And sometimes, Ethan thought as he unlocked the door and ushered Alice inside, sometimes that was all the happy ending anyone really needed.